And now we're going to have one of the things that we really wanted to do in this session, which we've done every year, is to try to have a big think session. And when I was talking to Steve GLICKMAN and John Lettieri about the two people we most wanted to have a big think session and someone to facilitate that, we said Jim Tankersley of Vox with Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum, also well known as former head of the Congressional Budget Office and advisor to John McCain. I'll tell you later when we're having drinks about my conversation about him up in, was it Wasilla, Alaska or something? You know, we'll do that over drinks. And he was tutoring Sarah Palin. And my good friend Jason Furman, who's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and of course, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. So please, gentlemen, take the stage. Let's think big and knock it out of the park for us. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve, so much.
How are we doing this?
He told me over here.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. It's been a long and fantastic day, and we're really grateful and delighted to be here at the end. At least I am. Our panelists are fantastic. They're smart, and unfortunately, they don't disagree on as much as you might hope. But,
that's why we're on the same sofa.
Yeah, but we're going to get there. Trust me. We're going to try to drive some wedges.
We don't like you, so we're...
Right. Yeah, no, they are united against the press, as I can tell you from many times trying to pin them down on things over the years. But I want to start with this is a big think session, with a really big question. And I'll start by talking about another big thinker who is well known to folks in this room. I sat down last month with Ben Bernanke, and we were talking about the big problems facing the US economy right now. And he said, far and away, the biggest is productivity. It's on which all of our other problems, all the things we've been talking about here today, hinge. And I guess I would turn his concern to the two of you and ask, how do we solve the least sexy, most vexing problem in the economy today? Jason, you want to start?
Sure. So first of all, let me just restate the problem as a way of killing time so that you won't notice I don't have something that fully solves the problem. Productivity has been growing over the last decade at about 1% a year in the United States. That's terrible compared to our past. If you want to cheer yourself up a tiny bit, you can look at the other advanced economies and see that they're doing even worse than the United States is. So the first thing to understand is that it's been a global slowdown. The second thing to understand is wages can grow faster than productivity, or they can grow slower than productivity. But over longer periods of time, compensation is going to have to roughly keep track with productivity. And so productivity growth sets really a ceiling on what the sustainable long-run level of income growth is. And so that means right now, real incomes could be at 1% a year. And by the way, no one's super thrilled with wage growth right now. Real wage growth is already running at about that 1% a year. So it's about where productivity is. So I think this is, and then last is our fiscal situation. If we could get an extra quarter point on productivity, that would eliminate half of the fiscal gap over the next quarter century. So
that's an excellent setup and filibuster.
But
how about an answer?
Okay, so it's a problem. So I think part of that diagnosis of the problem, though, gave you part of the answer. That I don't think this is the Affordable Care Act. I don't think it's Dodd-Frank. I don't think it's those things, because you've seen a bigger productivity slowdown in a lot of other countries that didn't pass the Affordable Care Act, like the United States did in 2010. I think some of this is just good old-fashioned solutions. Business tax reform that is revenue neutral, expanding trade, investing more in infrastructure and research, having more education. Those are the conventional list, and I think they'd get you decently far. I think the more mysterious part of it is that there's less turnover and dynamism in the economy, less people switching from job to job, less new businesses being formed, and just a slowdown in reallocation across the economy. In some ways, that's more troubling and a little bit harder to get at. Things like occupational licensing, land use restrictions, things like that may get at that, but I don't think we fully understand what's causing that reduction in dynamism and what we can do to solve that part of the productivity slowdown.
Doug?
So that's a good question. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone for a chance to be here today. I think it's a fantastic event, and I also like to sort of reframe it, because I think there was a bigger question behind it that's the most troubling to me. If you look back to sort of the 80s, 90s, the 80s witnessed the big intellectual fight over whether government-centric Soviet-style socialism or market economies were the way for the future on the globe, and we won. And there was this widespread agreement that that was the best way to go, and economies across the globe followed that in the 90s, and the US in particular had fantastic productivity growth. And so a recipe that was built on private markets with not zero government, I mean there were government interventions, I don't want to oversell it, but with a reliance on markets and economic freedom and some dynamism that came with it, all this stuff would be fine. And so I think the larger issue behind this is not what policy levers you pull to get better productivity growth, and I'm going to agree with a lot of the levers that Jason's talking about. It's the fact that there is no longer a consensus in the United States even about what's the model? How are we going to run ourselves? How much are we going to rely on economic freedom, let people decide for themselves and trust their decisions? How much are we going to do things based on policy objectives out of Washington, D.C.? And since there's no faith in any model, it's very hard to get the consensus to even pull the policy levers, and so we're not. So I think the really deep question is, what do we believe will work? And that's the one that I think is the most troubling right now. If you could get that, I think we could get the list of things that you'd probably want to do anyway, but which, as you do them, you should orient them toward getting better productivity and thus economic performance. So I think it's a no-brainer that you'd want to have a regulatory state that did a benefit cost analysis of a reg and chose the lowest cost way to pass a benefit cost test. That's a regulatory reform that's on the table. That seems unobjectionable just in and of itself, but at this point in time, when we have fewer business startups and we seem to have a less flexible and dynamic economy, we ought to push that forward. That seems like the right thing to do. We ought to do tax reform because our tax code doesn't mean anything. It ought to reflect a set of values. What are you trying to do as you raise that revenue? So have a pro-growth tax reform, because that's what we need right now. The education system, same thing. Have an infrastructure program targeted on national connectivity and better economic performance. Right? We need infrastructure. How are we going to focus our priorities? So I think those are all things that make sense, but I'm not sure that we can get them because people don't believe that they're going to work, and that's the issue.
But is it that people don't believe they're going to work, or is it that people are focused on an entirely different set of problems? Like if we look at the lesson of the last election, I think from an economic standpoint, it's that people want to know how you're going to bring back the jobs they used to have, at least the marginal voters in the states that marginally decided the election. That's a very different question from how are you going to make the economy more efficient, more productive, and create the jobs of the future. So to what degree is Washington or the country right now stuck on the wrong problem?
Look, I mean, I think part of the problem with what I'm advocating, and I think there's some validity not to, keeping every single coal job or any other industrial job except the media.
Which really is an industrial job, by the way, putting up with these guys every day.
But I think that question of what you can do to create jobs for people is a really important and valid one, and we should come back to it. I think the problem we have on this productivity growth stuff is you do the whole agenda I said, and maybe our growth rate would be 0.5 point higher per year. And I think that itself would be quite a lot. After a decade, that would accumulate up to a lot for a typical family. But it's not going to transform everything. It's not going to be hugely noticeable to anyone right away. And so what I have to offer is a long list of things to accomplish less than what people want. What the president has to offer is a very short list of things. It's going to do everything that everyone wants, with the one minor obstacle that it won't, but we'll find out about that later. So that's why he's president, and I'm on this panel with you.
Doug, are you?
Mark to market again.
Right, yeah. Doug, to what degree, you brought up the 80s. And in the 80s, it wasn't just that the market consensus went out globally, it was that in the United States there was a very clear set of policies that were pursued in an attempt to boost growth, both monetary policies, which is even more boring of a conversation than productivity, and tax policies. Are we in a similar moment to the 80s? There are a lot of people who would have us believe we're in a similar moment to the 80s with similar potential for growth with changes in the tax code. Do you think that we are there?
Yes and no. I think we're there in that we could change the trajectory of productivity growth significantly and improve people's well-being. The 80s also witnessed big demographic changes that aided the top-line growth that we're just not going to get. I mean, we saw through the 80s and 90s rising female labor force participation and things that caused top-line growth to just be a lot faster. So, you can't replicate that piece. But one of the things that went on in the 70s was we had this sort of monetary policy that was trying to fine-tune the economy, and fiscal policy was trying to fine-tune the economy, and it was all this belief that we could, target inflation to get the unemployment rate we want and play the trade-off and really very interventionist discretionary policies, and it failed miserably on the whole. And there was a conscious decision made that monetary policy would take care of whatever responses were needed for high-frequency economic events. Fiscal policy and the regulatory apparatus would be set for long-term economic growth. And that stuck for about 20 years, and it really worked. And then we lost our way collectively, both Republicans and Democrats. If you think of the number of sort of discretionary fiscal policies, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2005, 2008, I mean, I think it's time to go back to let's set these policies for long-run growth and leave the monetary authority with the job to which they are best suited, which is near-term stabilization.
You were worried we wouldn't disagree enough.
I actually wasn't. Go ahead.
I'll disagree a bit with this one. I mean, I think part of why we're using fiscal policy more is that the equilibrium interest rate has fallen a lot. That means there's less room for the Fed to cut rates and get the economy out of a recession. And that's why in the last experience we went through, fiscal policy was so important. And in fact, we didn't have enough of it. We would have grown faster and gotten out of it even faster if we had had more fiscal policy. I think, though, the aspiration of more freedom, more long-run focus, let monetary policy do the stabilization is a good one. I think the way we could get to that would be if we integrated and greatly improved the automatic stabilizers we had in fiscal policy. We had unemployment insurance benefits that automatically extended in a recession, Medicaid payments that dialed up in a recession, maybe even a tax cut or a check you'd get every time the unemployment rate went above 8%. I think if we did things like that, we could bolster the way that fiscal policy deals with recession, take some of the burden off of monetary policy, which I don't think it can fully handle in a low interest rate world, and then refocus on Doug's agenda.
So Doug, to go back to your agenda for a second, how much, what's the ceiling on growth from the best possible pro-growth tax cut right now?
I wouldn't call it a tax cut. I'd say it'd be the best pro-growth tax reform. And I believe that there are some criteria you need to apply to this that are important. Number one, it should be permanent. And so as a matter of sort of Senate procedure, if it's going to be done in the current circumstances, that means it has to be revenue neutral so that it doesn't have to sunset. I also think that it's really important to make tax reform revenue neutral even if there wasn't that constraint, because tax reform is really hard to get. We know that now. Last one was 86. I'm now old enough that I saw the aftermath of the 86 reform, which was a tax code that didn't deliver the revenue that we expected. It was supposed to be a tax increase on corporations to finance the rate cuts on the individual side. It didn't quite work out. We ran what we thought were very large nominal deficits, 100, 150 billion, and in the process, there became a hunger for revenue, and you saw the tax code get opened up, and the sort of integrity of the reform went away very quickly, remarkably quickly. And so my lesson from that is it's really hard to get tax reform. It's even harder to keep it. And if you do it in a less than revenue neutral fashion, you're sowing the seeds of your own destruction, because you're going to come to a point where you're going to need the revenue and the integrity of the tax code will get eaten up. So I really worry about that and the notion of tax cuts being the solution. Tax cuts aren't the answer right now. But this is all going to be about supply side growth. We're near full employment. The things we need to worry about are things which are permanent structural changes in the tax code, move from a worldwide toward a territorial system, things that are going to be there and change the fundamental scale and location of business decisions and transform us from a slow growth to a fast growth economy. So I think that's the kind of thing we need, and I think that can get you a 0.5 percentage point. That's probably the upper bound. If it was done in an utterly disciplined fashion that is foreign to our lawmakers. But if we did that, you could get it.
Jason, do you agree that we could get a 0.5% growth?
I would have put the number at 0.3% and would.
That's because he was more recently at the White House. See,
Right.
If you work at the CEA ever, the president's preferred policy always gets you 0.3%. Go read all the ERPs. They all say the same thing.
Fair enough. That's actually the number the Treasury had for a similar proposal when the President's Tax Reform Commission had it. And it's a number that Alan Auerbach, Larry Kotlikoff, and Ken Smetters had a number of years ago on a research proposal. It wasn't sort of pulled entirely out of thin air, but maybe that's the number we'd always come up with. But I really would underscore that doing it well, and in particular, the most likely thing that Congress does to undermine proposals like this is to add in a lot of transition rules, and a lot of those economic benefits come off of having a clean transition. And then the other two things in the plan, one was switching to expensing and getting rid of the interest deduction. That's moving us towards more of a consumption tax for basis. I think that's a good idea and worth doing. I think I like that idea more than an awful lot of Republicans do, even though historically it had been a little bit more of a Republican than Democratic idea. And then border adjustment, you could argue either side of, but some of the economic benefits are coming from a tax policy analysis of that may be missing out some of the broader macro risks associated with that proposal.
So I just want to underscore, on the political economy, this is the fundamental problem. To get better growth, to get productivity, you must defer satisfaction, save, invest in ideas or people or equipment or business models or something that generates a larger economic pie. And the political system is not built on deferring satisfaction. It's built on providing it. And so it's really hard to get a good pro-growth tax reform through the Congress. It is.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think that the debate we're having right now tries to talk about the longer run growth issues while promising the short run satisfaction also. And this is where I think maybe we're talking even too small by confining ourselves to taxes.
It shouldn't just be taxes. My list is very long. Given how poorly we understand productivity growth and what limited sort of direct impacts we have on it, and in this moment how important it is to the American people that we perform better as an economy, we should do everything. We should, that economic agenda should encompass thinking about growth in the context of every policy. And at every juncture, at every policy decision, it should be, which is the most pro-growth option? Do that.
But see, here's my concern if we only, I again, totally endorse faster growth, but my concern is that if you only focus on growth, then you just sort of increase the water supply basically coming through the pipes. But the pipes are leaking, inequality is high, regional concentration is large right now, and certain areas are benefiting a lot more than others. Then you risk increasing those gaps between people, participants in the economy. How do you fix that? Because I think that could end up coming back to a productivity problem, not getting the best out of everybody who lives everywhere.
Look, I think you look at let's just take, this is not a regional point, but it's a distributional point, so it's your leaky pipe. Look at the CBO score in 2016 of repealing the Affordable Care Act. They said it would add a little bit less than 0.1% to the growth rate per year over the next decade. Now, I could argue with that score. I could point out all the great things it does to increase flexibility, people moving from job to job, making the workforce healthier, and the like. But let's just stipulate that that's the case. After a decade, how much does that add up to it? The 25th percentile? It adds up to an extra $200 in income. Is it worth 25 million people losing their health insurance and tens of millions of people losing benefits that are worth $10,000 a year in order to get an extra $200 of income? No way. Even if I believe that growth thing, I think that would be a really bad way to get additional growth. So I think you really need to integrate in the distributional analysis of the impact it has on people across the income spectrum, regions, et cetera, in with it. Some of them, revenue neutral business tax reform, I don't think that really has a distributional implication. So I think we can take the ideology out, take the distribution out, have a bunch of technicians figure out how to make the tax code as pro-growth as possible. There'll be a bigger pie. My guess is that'll mean more for everyone. If it doesn't, we can always raise taxes a bit here, cut them there. But a lot of other policies aren't of that nature. Regulatory policies, you may get an extra smidgen of growth, and much more climate change, and that was a bad deal to have made also. So I think you do need a broader analysis and can't just be growth, growth, growth. It is what's the cost of the growth. I think a lot of times it'll pass the test, but I wouldn't blindly assume it always does.
But to just push you on that point then, I mean, one way that you could read the slow growth right now of the advanced economies is that we had a big risk event that came to pass in the financial crisis, and that we have amped up our risk aversion and piled on a lot of regulation to, like, we've hit the brakes, understandably, but that there are consequences to hitting the brakes, and that's not just us, that's a lot of other countries that are worried about their financial industries. Do you see that as a trade-off, first off, and if so, is an acceptable one?
Look, take financial regulation. You're deciding how much capital a bank needs to hold. I think it's perfectly plausible that the higher that capital amount, the lower your average growth rate is in normal times. But I think it also means the odds that you go into the type of massive financial crisis that we just went through, wipe off a lot of GDP and have that cost permanently, have also gone down. And so you want to weigh those against each other. A little bit slower growth in normal times, a little bit less chance of catastrophic loss of growth every 40 years. Where do you set the balance? The economists who have done that at the Fed and elsewhere think that we've set it reasonably right. If anything, capital adequacy should be a little bit higher rather than a little bit lower than where it is now. So I think that would be a good example where you can actually, with a certain amount of heroism, try to quantify that trade-off, where I think we've made that trade-off in a reasonable way. There may be other places where we've made it in an unreasonable way, and I'm sure Doug will point one of them out.
The unreasonable way is sitting to the right of me. No, I think Jason said it exactly right. I just disagree with the bottom line, right? If you think about it, he went through exactly the exercise I said. Well, let's think about a trade-off between growing and a social policy like health insurance. Choose the social policy. Let's think about a choice between growing more rapidly and environmental policy. We choose the environmental policy. We have a choice between growing more rapidly and a tail event in the financial markets. Well, we'll worry about the tail event in the financial markets. What do you end up with? Bad growth. I don't think it's a shock.
But you also favor a carbon tax, I would like to point out.
If you're going to do something that's economically efficient. So, clean power plan? No. Carbon tax? Yes.
So, all these are risks.
But I don't.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think growth is an end in and of itself.
No, but it is the single most power impact on the distribution you care about. If you want the average American to be better off, that's the thing we need.
But I just gave you an example. Let's say we believe those numbers, that you thought you were going to raise the growth rate by 0.5% a year, and the only way you could do that would be reducing benefits to 20 million people by 10,000 a year. Let's say that was your policy choice. I would look at that and say, no, that doesn't pass a test for me. There'd be 20 million people worse off, even net of the growth. You'd look at it and say,
we can do better than that policy trade-off. First of all, I don't believe that's the trade-off, but it's not picking once. It's serial picking, always picking against growth. That's the problem.
So to broaden out again from growth back into the question of sort of the grand ailment of the economy right now and the way that it affects people in the country. It is more than just the growth isn't finding its way to certain places or certain people. It's that there has been in the market system a sense that it doesn't work everywhere and for everyone, and that has created conditions where both political parties in certain ways have turned against that system. So to take your frame, Doug,
right?
How do you? Let's start with your party. How do you get Republicans off the idea that you want to close down trade deals or shut off immigration, which is a very pro-growth policy, and to focus again on these more pro-growth initiatives?
So let me avoid that question, which is hard, and just point out the core problem here, in my view, the way I frame it is, you look at post-war to 2007, growth in GDP fast enough that even with the baby boom arriving, GDP per capita doubles roughly every 35 years. You look forward, GDP per capita doubles every 75 years. So the capacity to reach the American dream is taking too long, independent of where you are in the distribution. That's assuming it's not even somehow accruing only to a subset. That's the problem. And yes, might want to fine-tune where that faster growth lands, but first let's get it. And I think not getting it because we're worried that it won't work out right has been a big problem. I will just stipulate that I believe some of the most important aspects of pro-growth policy are embedded in our international economic relations, immigration, trade, capital flows as well. But if you look at the legal immigrant population, no one's in favor of illegal immigration, right? Legal immigrant population, they work more, longer, retire later, they disproportionately start businesses, hire people, they are more entrepreneurial than the native-born population. They are nothing but economic good news. And that case just has to be made and made again because it's a mistake to pass up that opportunity. We are going to compete with those people. The only question is, are they going to be across an ocean or across the street? And I'd rather have them across the street. Trade agreements, you look back to, the 89, 90 when I was first in the White House, in that era, oh my God, Japan was eating our lunch. We were never going to be able to make a semiconductor. We couldn't possibly make a screen for something. It was all going to be gone. We signed a trade agreement in semiconductors, lowered everyone's tariffs to zero. We ate their lunch. We can compete, and we should. And it will be good for productivity. It will be good for the American worker.
Jason, are there ways in which you worry the Democrats have drifted away on these issues? And they're different ones. I mean, trade is, Democrats have always had a very mixed, you guys know this, relationship with trade deals, and your candidate in 2016 definitely campaigned against the deal that your administration really wanted to get ratified. But beyond that, in terms of the skill mix of immigrants, in terms of these regulatory trade-offs we've been talking about, is there room for the Democratic Party to move more in a market growth direction also?
Yeah. Look, I think what we should all be able to do is walk and chew gum. The ultimate test of how the economy does is how people are doing at the 50th percentile, at the 25th percentile, the bottom 90%, et cetera. Growth is an important ingredient in that, but the distribution of income is a really important ingredient in that too, and I think we need both of these. Where we can find policies that help growth and help inequality, those are the best and the most exciting, and we should rush off and do them. Where they have a trade-off, then we need to think a little bit harder, and in some cases it may be worth doing, in some cases not, and we might draw that line in a different place. I think the Democratic Party has probably been better on the inequality part of that and less, absolutely laser-like focused on the growth part of that. I think they're probably in both parties, as Doug said, certain presentism, what can you do to relieve someone's constraints today, as opposed to what can you do to put people in a better place for the future. That being said, the Democrats are also the party that champions infrastructure, scientific research, education, a lot of the things that I think are really important to economic growth. I just wish they had equal enthusiasm, for trade. And by the way, immigration a decade ago was much more controversial in the Democratic Party than it is now. The Democratic Party has really come around to subscribing to part a non-economic argument for it, which I agree with and relate to, and in part the economic argument that Doug made really well is one that resonates with a lot of Democrats. So, yeah, so I could see improvement there, but I would still vote Democratic in the next election, is my guess.
Even if it's a protectionist, populist who wants...
Who runs for president for re-election? Yes, right. Even then.
That was good. Because it is a Washington panel and late in the day, I am contractually obligated now to bring up the skills gap. But I'm struck...
Doug has none.
Right, I'm struck by how this is...
I agree that Jason is smarter than me. Next question.
He does juggle better than you. This is an issue, though, that for years and years and years, it was all any candidate wanted to talk to you about. We need better training. We need to help workers, displaced workers better. There's grand agreement among economists that we did not do a good enough job of retraining workers who were displaced by the trade technology shocks of the 90s and 2000s, and yet now it is a thing you almost never hear about from the current administration or in Congress. is this an issue that has sort of passed us by? Is education and the skills question not relevant to our politics and to answering these questions today?
To my eye, this has always been one that got more lip service than active policymaking, and I can't say I'm really happy about that. Certainly, the core need for better K-12 education remains unmet. I mean, we're now a decade and a half after No Child Left Behind began identifying massive failure in the K-12 education system. And there's documentation of people like Rick Hanushek out at Hoover who basically say, look, if we could get the US K-12 system to perform as well as the Canadian K-12 system, and that's not even like Chinese, there's no Manchurian involved, just that, we'd have 20% higher real wages. It's the single most dramatic economic policy you can imagine. It's huge. But it takes 18 years to see any payoff. And so this is what we run into with these, God bless you.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know what they are, but I hear they're...
The thinking's going to be a lot bigger
there you
now.
go.
Yeah, this is like, cheers, guys.
I want to tease all of you that, now the conversation is going to get interesting.
Wait, you did not say we had to be interesting, Steve.
Welcome to the Madman session.
Right, yeah. Keep going, Doug.
No, but so that to me is quite frustrating. I mean, that's just well identified, big payoff, just takes too long, doesn't get done. The displaced worker issue from whatever source. I've never liked displaced worker being tied to trade. A dynamic economy displaces workers, and you should have a strategy toward dealing with that. And our strategy is quite counterproductive in most cases. So that's a harder one because we've not found a uniform model for success that we think we can scale up to the national level. We have found some sort of success stories in community colleges and other initiatives, some apprenticeship programs, a variety of things. But that's a harder sell. It's a real issue.
Right. I mean, on that second one, I think right now we're not really trying. I mean, we spend 2% of our 0.2% of our GDP on programs in that area. That's a smaller fraction than any OECD economy, with the exception of Chile and Mexico. It's 1/10 what Denmark spends on that set of activities. I agree there's a mixed set of results in terms of programs there, but there are some big successes, and you named the two I would have named in terms of community colleges and apprenticeships. And so I think we need to be experimenting more, but I think there's no substitute for actually investing more and spending more in that area. Taking the different set of programs we have also and harmonizing them. So as Doug said, you don't really care if you lost your job because of trade or because your boss was an idiot or because the technology was outmoded. All three of those, you lost your job. You should get the same assistance. And then to some degree, for just protecting people from the loss. We give you really great insurance if you lose a job and can't find one. But if you lose a job and you're willing to take one that doesn't pay as much as your old job and you're an older worker and you're past the age when maybe we can effectively retrain you, we could insure you against that too with wage insurance. I think those are all the types of policies that would, to take it back to where I began, this reduction in dynamism and churn in the economy that we're so concerned about. I think it would help remedy that, make it more palatable, and move us forward. So if you did lose that job in journalism and all you could find was a job as a coal miner, we would pay the difference in salary.
What if all you can do is find a job as an economist? That would be even worse. Just saying.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can I say that I think he's optimistic? I think we do an even worse job than that.
Yeah.
Just think about unemployment insurance. We want to have an economy where people have spells of unemployment because we want to create lots of jobs and get rid of the jobs that are really not meeting market tests and things like that. But what does our unemployment insurance system say to people? Does it prepare them for that? No. It says, oh, you're unemployed? You got to wait a couple weeks to get any help. Once you get some help, you get more if you stay unemployed longer. And by the way, if you really know that you're economically obsolete and want to go to a training program, you have to exhaust your benefits first. Then you can get on with the training. It's all nuts.
So these are, again, like important, but I would call them incremental changes that we're talking about. What's the most radical idea, big picture idea that you have come to think should be considered over the last few years that you maybe didn't think about before?
The two ideas I would consider are large-scale wage subsidies to make it more profitable to hire people with less skills, give them an incentive to work, and make sure they're being rewarded for that work. It's a lot of administrative things. I'm not positive I'm in favor of it, but I'm sympathetic to people who are enthusiastic and trying to make it work. And then the second is some type of guaranteed employment of some sort, or government employment, or some backstop for people who we have a really hard time incorporating in the workforce. I think thinking in that direction of how you can get people into jobs and make the economy function, rather than something like a universal basic income, which I interpret as giving up on people having jobs and not worrying about the problem. I have much more sympathy for people thinking really hard, worried about how to solve that employment problem with big ideas along those two lines.
Doug?
So we've actually ended up in the same place, I think. But me on worried about the capacity of people to have a job and to take advantage of a job. And the hard thing for conservatives who want to stay out of people's lives is, I believe we have reached a point when we need some interventions, early in life that have been documented, sort of, educational interventions and things for kids, but also their parents. And some of them single, some of them not, but where they seem incapable of and do not pursue things that are in their children's interest and their interest. And there are examples in other countries of sort of dealing with a set of socio-economic issues that allow people to sort of integrate back into the economy and the rest of society. And I hate to go there, but I think it's that time has come. And I mean, the simple example that they tried in Britain was just have essentially coaches, and they had outcome measures, and the outcome measures were really simple. Mom goes to work, dad goes to work, kid goes to school, no one goes to jail. If that happens, you get some support. You don't get those outcomes, no support. And coaching on how then to go to work every day, coaching on what it means to go to work every day, what it means to go to school, sounds like something that no Republican would ever propose. But I mean, I think we need to think hard about this, because the difference between success and failure in America is work. And the capacity to do work is now in question in too many cases. And that's the problem at the low end.
So then what do you do about the Americans who want to work, who work hard, and whose work has been devalued over the last 20 years, who used to be a $20 an hour laborer and now are a $10 an hour laborer because what they did is no longer something that humans do in America, and they have not been able to find something that pays better? I think Jason would say wage subsidies, but what would
That's
what
the
would your
wage
plan be?
insurance
Yeah.
argument. I'd go for retraining and a better growth environment so that there's better opportunities for them out there.
And do you think there's any way to solve, back long ago, months ago, when I was an economics reporter?
And quite frankly, let's not create more people like that, right? That's a legacy of an era in which you could say to someone, hey, get a high school education, go to work at the factory, and you can live like a college-educated person. That's not true anymore. Pick up the employment report every month. That is an advertisement for getting an education. The unemployment rate's under 4%.
So should there then
So
be
there
some-
should be, do not count on living like a college-educated person if you don't want to become college-educated. That's a lie. It can't happen.
Should there be more government support then for higher education, whether that's community college?
They don't need more money. I was a college professor for 20 years. Do not give them another dime. Make them perform.
I think the issue there is not the median student for whom the return to an education is much higher than the cost of that education, but a substantial tail for whom that's not true. Something like income-based repayment that we expanded in our administration, but it's still too complicated and difficult. Streamlining that, having a system like Australia where you pay a certain amount for college, you pay it because you're going to get the benefit of that college. You want to evaluate, is it worth paying for what I'm going to get? And then on your tax form, they're going to collect that money every year. Once you've repaid it, they stop collecting it. And if you get a certain number of years, they'll forgive it. So things that help insure people for the risks associated with the choice of going to college, I think would be the right way to handle it, as opposed to more money for everyone.
But I would argue among the phenomena that's feeding that tail, and that's a real issue, Jason's right, is the K-12 system. Because if you want to find somebody who's likely to have a student debt problem, who's likely not graduate or graduate in 6 years, find somebody who needs remedial help their first year. It is the single most powerful predictor of all those problems, and it's because the K-12 system didn't do their job. And they exist in private schools and public schools. They're in high-income families and low-income families. It's to me, the pervasive problem.
All right, we've got 20 seconds, super lightning round. In what year will we have our next recession? Jason?
It'll begin with a 2.
Doug, if you can beat that answer, you are our winner today.
It will end with an integer.
Ladies and gentlemen, Doug Holtz-Eakin and Jason Furman. Thanks, guys.
Big thanks to Jim, Jason, and Doug. Sorry we have to kick you off stage, but everyone's got a drink, so. And you guys have already started.
Head out that way.
Come on this way, guys.
Well, come on. Okay.
Did you try those drinks?
Thanks for
They're strong.
I'm not in the government anymore, so anyone who wants to give me anything, just go ahead.
Notice for the record, Steve did not give the money back. He put it right in his pocket, just so everyone's clear. So first, let me thank all of you for being here all day long, or we assume all day long. And let me just pose a couple quick questions, and then I'll introduce Steve, and we'll let everyone out for cocktails. So we started the day talking about how economic policy is a topic du jour, not just in Washington, but everywhere around the country. And we've had an amazing set of speakers who've had a substantive, deep, complicated conversation about what's happening in this country. Some have been very optimistic. Some have thought the future of America is inevitably going to work out because we're an innovative country, because it's always worked out, because we've managed to transition, because we have a terrific, talented pool of people. Some people have suggested that we have a real problem we're looking forward to, that there aren't going to be enough jobs, that we don't have a good system of training, that the debt is going to run up uncontrollably, and that nothing's going to happen in DC to solve those problems. I laid that out so people would be really depressed and ready to drink. And I think the real question is, what do we do to transition this conversation to more places around the country? Why aren't we having a substantive conversation along these lines in the press, in our politics, in Congress, and what does it take to get us there? What does it take to bring this to more communities? And what does it take and what do we need and expect from our leadership to step up and take on these issues? Not just our public leadership, not just our political leadership, but our private sector leadership. What does it take for people to step up and say, there's a lot of tough issues we have to grapple with and we're going to take it on? And I think that's the challenge that we leave today with. At the Economic Innovation Group, we're a young organization. That's part of why we were created, to address one specific set of these issues, which is how do you get the private sector, particularly investor and entrepreneurs, more engaged in the question of the uneven economic recovery and the divide that's happened in this country between people, among communities, among folks with various skill sets. How do you make zip code not be destiny for whether you can achieve the American dream or not? So one, we hope you will join us in that effort. More of these conversations, be a part of the work we're doing at EIG. And then I think even more importantly, I want to thank the visionaries of this program who have been carrying on the Summit on the Economy for the last 7 years. So of course that's Steve Clemons, who, did he leave? Oh no, he's right behind me. That's Steve Clemons, who is, we had a lot of conversations running up to this event. The most important thing he said is he wants to generate a really good, diverse conversation. And that's really Steve's mission in life, is to make sure people are exploring a set of issues in a way they don't normally explore in this city. And we all owe him a big debt of gratitude for his willingness and ability to do that. So a big round of applause for Steve. And he'll, I know, say some final words in just a minute, but also I want to thank the Governor's Woods Foundation. They are the generous hand underwriting this program. They ensure that this event is free and accessible for anyone who wants to come. So for the wonderful work they do and in helping us be here, a big thank you to them as well. So with that, let me introduce again one of my favorite people, Steve Clemons.
Thank you, Steve. We call him G, we call me C. I really want to thank you, and I want to thank both John Lettieri and Steve GLICKMAN for their partnership in this. Over here in the far corner, you'll see someone, she's Risa Mueller, works with the Governor's Woods Foundation. She has been one of the incredible dynamos behind the scene. Carolyn Lanford, right here, stand up, Carolyn. She's been my right hand in this. We have Milica Koshik somewhere over here in the back, right? She's been running around the mic. These are like the people who really did everything. There are lots more I'm going to read in a moment. But about the content and substance, I don't want to say much more than Steve did, but Jason had to run off. But all day, this forum was, I think, packed with provocative, interesting, mind-stretching moments. I think what Jim Tankersley just moderated in a fascinating conversation between Doug Holtz-Eakin and Jason Furman is exactly the kind of thing that I would like to see be more of our daily fare. It would be a much better place. And so we're very fortunate to be able to do this once a year for the last 7 years, bring some fascinating people together. But I want to just very quickly, before we go off, and you all experiment with what I think Doug had, which was If Life Gives You Clemons. That is the drink he had, and it looked like he was very happy with it. And
10 cents of every one of those drinks goes directly to Steve.
yeah, that's I got. Yeah. So, but let me first thank Steve GLICKMAN, John Lettieri, Amanda Bird, Keenan Fikri, Liz Hipple, Milica Koshik, Risa Mueller, Ben Schwartz, Jessica Spiegel, Carolyn Lanford, Alex Severn, Claire Nolan, Hugh Monahan, Lars Arneson, Peter Newhan, and Sarah Page Silvestro. A round of applause for all of those people because they really did outstanding work. And I want to ask you all to applaud yourselves. This is a long darn day. This is like a packed in university class. We don't charge you, but boy, we drag you through a lot. Give yourself a round of applause for making it through. And the least we can do from the Governor's Woods Foundation and EIG is buy you a drink. So the doors are going to be open out here. Let's go there's the Lettieri Lazy Fair, the GLICKMAN G7, the Vaguely in Debt, and the If Life Gives You Clemons. So thank you all for joining us.